Okay, so this is assessment part two. My video recorder that I use will only allow me to record 15 minutes, and we were running out of time, so I thought it was better to come to an end and start over again. So, looking at all the different ways to grade. So, this is you have given a test or you have given a quiz, and I want you to think about which ones of these things that you prefer, which ones of these things do you not prefer. So, partial credit. Okay, so there's some positives and negative both ways. If you are, let's say, a civil engineer and you make one error in your calculations, and your buddy is a civil engineer and he makes 15 errors in your calculations, both of your bridges are going to fall. Both of you have failed at bridge building. So, in that respect, the idea of partial credit, like, does it even matter how many mistakes you made? At the end of the day, you got it wrong. So, some people use that as a way to say no on the partial credit. Other people say, well, if you are a person who does 90% of the work and you just drop a negative at the end of the problem, shouldn't you get 90% of the credit because you showed what you could do as opposed to your buddy who couldn't even start the problem? Why should you both get the same score when you clearly knew more? So that's kind of an argument for partial credit. So I am not telling you whether you should be a partial credit person or a not partial credit person. This is just a decision you need to think about and you need to decide before you start grading things, before you get into it, so that you have your decision made, what works best for you, what you can justify in your mind, and then which way you want to go. So, similar to that would be the idea of corrections or no corrections. So, often people who give partial credit say, well, I'm not going to do corrections because I've already given you a bunch of credit. People who say no partial credit say, but I'm going to let you come back and do corrections. So, if you kind of crisscross on those, then you are balancing out. I'm not going to give you um, any corrections, but I'm going to give you credit for all the work that you've done. Or I am going to give you credit for corrections because I'm not going to give you any credit for pieces of work throughout the process. Some of this is outside of your control. For example, in the Rock Hill School District, I am required to allow my students to correct any major assignment up to an 80%. That is not something I can control. That is not something they asked my opinion about. They just said, this is the way it's going to be. Similarly, I am not allowed to give corrections on any minor assignment. So again, they didn't ask my opinion, they just said, this is the way it's going to be. So if you have a very strong opinion about one of these things, that's a question you need to be asking in an interview. I am 100% against corrections. So I need to find out what this district does, because if I get a job in this district and I'm required to allow my students to do corrections, I'm going to be miserable. On the other hand, if I'm a corrections person and I'm not allowed to do corrections, I'm going to be equally as miserable. So that's something you need to reason through. You need to come to some conclusions about. Personally, I'm a partial credit person. I believe you ought to get credit for the good work that you do. I know I might still be a freshman at Georgia Tech if I didn't get partial credit on my assignments there. So I kind of keep that in the back of my mind. If that's how I was at 18, imagine how my students are at 12 and 13. On the other hand, I would prefer not to do corrections, but I don't have a choice. My school district says I am doing corrections. So that's something that I have to work with. I put some teeth behind that. You're not allowed to come in and do corrections unless you have come to tutoring twice and you have shown me that you are learning more. Then you can come in and do corrections. Sometimes instead of allowing you to correct, I give you just an entirely new retake, and we'll see if you do better the second time around now that you've learned what it was you struggled with and had the opportunity to correct that. So, you just need to come to some decisions about that, and don't let it be a spur of the moment decision. This is something that when you step into your classroom that first day, you've already decided and you already have a plan in place about what you want to do. Okay, a little bit different here, not as far as giving credit, but just as the type of questions you want to put on a test. Are you a person who wants to put review items on a test? Are you a person who does not want to put review items on a test? So what I'm saying is if you are giving a test on, say, exponents, you're in the middle of your exponent unit, you have all kind of exponent questions on there, but you know that your previous unit was multiplying decimals and your students are still struggling with multiplying decimals. Are you going to choose to put some multiplying decimals questions on this test? Are you just going to continue doing multiplying decimals as a warm up or as an extra practice problem until your students get it? And again, it's really just a personal preference. The important thing is at the end of the time, your students are able to multiply decimals and also do exponents, right? At the end of the day, you just have to be able to say, my students have mastered these standards. Personally, I prefer to put review items on my homeworks. I put review items on my tests. I'm, again, a big spiraling curriculum person. And that is a hallmark of a spiraling curriculum. That doesn't mean that you have to do it if you're going to be a good teacher. That just means that's the way I like to do things. There are teachers who are equally as good, have equally as successful students, and they choose to do their review items in different ways. Again, at the end of the day, the thing is when your students walk out of your classroom, have they had the opportunity to master all of your standards? That's the goal. So think about these things, make some decisions about what you think and the way you want to run your classroom, and then go with it. And at Christmas, if what you're doing is great and it's working well, keep doing it. If at Christmas what you're doing is just an absolute disaster, then let's start making some adjustments and maybe plan to do some things a little bit differently. One thing I think is challenging as a new teacher is that you try something for 2 weeks and then you give up on it, or you try something new and you're constantly changing, and your students are in a constant state of confusion because there's no consistency. I know my niece and nephew both had a new teacher a couple years ago, and every time you turned around, this teacher was trying something new, and they really struggled in that year. They were both in middle school at the time, and they both really struggled that year because they didn't know what to expect from test to test, from week to week, from unit to unit. It was always changing. So it might be good to stick with something for long enough to figure out how to make it work instead of just abandoning it and moving on. Now, if you get into something and you realize that it is an utter disaster in September, don't feel like you have to keep it until December, but just consider the fact that you might not have given it long enough to work well if you're already throwing it out in mid September when you've only been doing this for like 2 weeks. Okay, so alternative assessments. Every student is not a test and quiz person. That paper and pencil test works well for a lot of students. Paper and pencil tests are important to train your students how to do. Paper and pencil tests are given K through college, K through grad school, but it's something that your students need to do well at. I am not saying that you should throw out tests. What I am saying is consider doing some other things also. Some of your students will thrive at things that are not tests, but still give you a good picture of what they can do. So, for example, I had a student when I taught eighth grade that she struggled on tests. But I mean, you give this girl a project and she was amazing, went above and beyond. Everything was unbelievable. It was almost as if a new person had inhabited her body when she was turning in these things. She just loved projects. And so when I would assign a project, she was going to just really take that on and do amazing, whereas on a test she might struggle. Both of those are ways for her to show her understanding, but she needs to have the opportunity to practice with both. Just because she's a project person doesn't mean she should never have to take a test. She still has to have that testing skill. All right, I'm going to post some examples of Blackboard of projects. One thing I will give you as a caution: if you give your students an alternative assessment, always make sure they know how they will be graded as soon as the assessment is given. So, a mistake from my past, my first year teaching, I had this project that my mentor teacher had done when I was a student teacher. And so I gave the project to my students. And then once they turned it in, I realized I didn't know what to do with them. How was I going to decide who got an A and who didn't? Like, I had made no plan for that whatsoever. My students also had no idea of how they were doing as they turned their project in. So I learned a big lesson. Always decide how it's going to be graded ahead of time. Give them that rubric. This is what I'm going to do to assess you. This is how you're going to earn your points. And then your students know what to expect, and you also know what to look for when you are grading. And that's true for any of these things. So if you choose to do a project, there should be a rubric attached to it so they know where their points are going to come from. Journaling is a great way to see your students' thought process because they have to write things out. You can ask some good why and how questions in a journal. A performance task is a possibility. Can you do this particular thing? I know the chemistry teachers at Rock Hill High have really jumped on this one, and I will say it has eliminated a lot of cheating in our chemistry classes as well because the teachers are watching the students do these things, and it makes the student really responsible for their own work. Observations and checklists, those are frequently used in special ed classes, but they can be brought into a mathematics class as well. This would maybe be a little bit more informal. Maybe this gives you something to talk to parents about in an email or in a parent conference. I'm not sure how some of these would translate well into being grades, but you may be able to make that work. An interview is definitely an idea. I had a student who did not write well as far as like writing down what I wanted him to write down on a test. But if I were to ask him, how do you solve this, and allow him to speak out loud as he was writing, his grades shot up. I ended up giving him some of his tests, just like letting him sit in the hallway so he could talk out loud. It really wasn't a huge accommodation, but it allowed him to do so much better because he was talking out loud. And the same thing can happen in other ways of doing interviewing. Maybe you're going to interview an expert in your field. Maybe you're going to have your student talk to another teacher and ask some questions. Like there's a lot of different ways to build in some interview skills. And then a portfolio. You guys probably have some experience with portfolios, putting in your best work, taking out work that's no longer representative of what you can do. But again, for all of those, the student just needs to know how they're going to be graded ahead of time. And any of those can be set up so that they can be a good representation of what the student knows and can do mathematically, even though some of these things, like we might think more of as a history or an English assignment, we can make it work for a mathematics assignment if we want. Okay, so this is from the rubrics that I am going to grade your assessment on. Remember, you're going to have to do two assessments for me. One is going to be a test. So for the algebra section that we are currently working on, you're going to write a test, and this is a test, not a quiz. So it should have quite a few different skills on it, and it should take your students quite a while to accomplish. If this is something that they can do in 10 minutes, it's probably a quiz, not a test. So make sure it is a very robust, rigorous assignment. But these are some of the things from the assessment rubric that I'm going to be looking for. Does it match the goals and objectives that you have set out for it? Does it have a variety of items and also types of items? So, and I think I said this in another video, a test that is strictly multiple choice is not a great test. There are ways to cheat around multiple choice tests and give you as a teacher the impression that the student knows more than they do, perhaps even allow the student the impression that they know more than they really do, or the student who says, man, I just guessed. I can't believe I got such a high grade on that test. I guessed on all of them. So there's nothing wrong with multiple choice, right? There's lots of multiple choice tests. A lot of standardized tests are multiple choice, so we need to practice that assessment technique. But that can't be our only measure because it has some limitations and drawbacks as well. And then, do we have questions of differing ability level? Are some of the questions aimed for those low students so that they can have some things they can be successful at? And then other problems are more aimed for the upper part of our class to give them a challenge. And then the last thing, this is from the EdTPA rubrics. So focusing on assessment and how you're going to use it to move forward. So what are you doing with the assessment once you've given it? How are you analyzing what happened and then using it to provide opportunities for future learning? It's not just about the assessment itself, it's about what you're going to do with it as you move forward.